As Paddy the Baddy continues to cultivate the UFC with a Ryobi tiller, his odds at becoming the undisputed champion are inching closer and closer to reality. What was once a silly non-factor is now somebody who might be headlining pay-per-views in the MGM Grand. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, while Paddy basks in what he believes to be his time to shine, he remains blissfully unaware of one thing. The UFC does not believe in Paddy Pimblett. And I'm going to use the stories of Conor McGregor and Bo Nickal, as well as a whole bunch of other shit, to prove that fact. But more importantly, I'm going to use that information to also prove why the UFC may be wrong and why their lack of belief may have cost them one of the greatest pay-per-view opportunities they've had since Conor himself. This is Paddy's dilemma. So the reason I bring Conor into this isn't because Paddy has similar charisma, media savviness, or any level of character that separates him from the little boxes Pete Seeger sung about. I bring Conor up because before the hype, back when McGregor vs. Poirier was worth 205,000 pay-per-view buys, he was just a loudmouth Irishman and nobody gave a shit. He kept talking like he was going to destroy everyone on the planet. Meanwhile, a third-grade Max Holloway was his most impressive win. So logically, the MMA community dismissed his existence altogether. Their assumption was that Dana would continue to give him easy fights until someone legitimate comes in and all of it goes kaput. It was only when he accepted a fight with another blue-chip prospect named Dustin Poirier that the fighting world finally started to take him seriously. Not enough to buy the pay-per-view, that thing flopped. But there was that classic non-verbal agreement between Conor and his doubters where it's like, okay, you beat this guy and I will officially allow myself to get hyped about you. So many guys talk shit before they actually prove themselves, but Dustin, that is a disgustingly validating matchup. And Conor spiced it up with all the same bulletproof confidence he was known for. Except this time, he's predicting a first-round knockout over a proven UFC warrior whose UFC record sparkled at 8-2. A guy whose chin had been tested by top-level prospects and proved to be unknockoutable. It was pure delusion to think Conor was going to pull off half the things he said he would. But look what happened. Well, two things happened. He knocked Dustin out in the first round, effectively legitimizing him as an elite contender. And then look at this. Look at this f***ing astronomical increase in viewership between UFC 178 and Fight Night Boston. You've got 178, that's McGregor Poirier. It comes in at 205,000 pay-per-view buys with an average of 697,000 prelim freeloaders. Then you go to Fight Night Boston, which Conor headlined 4 months after beating Dustin. The average viewership when you include the prelims was almost 3 million people. 4 times the average viewership of UFC 178 and 10 times the average viewership of Fight Night Dublin, which Conor headlined 2 months before he fought Dustin. This leaves no question in my mind that what truly gave Conor his fame wasn't the fact that he talked way too much shit for his britches. It was his willingness to actually walk the walk with one of the best featherweights in the division, as opposed to just headlining Dublin cards against nobodies forever. Now, how does any of that have to do with Paddy? Well, it has everything to do with Paddy, but we got to get to Bo first, otherwise none of this is going to make sense. If there was a UFC popularity contest, it would have a restraining order against Bo Nickal. Because if you purchased every pay-per-view Bo Nickal's been on, you will have effectively spent $57 to find out he isn't shit. But be that as it may, nobody knew that was the truth until De Ridder smashed him. Before that, he was in a very similar situation to the one our boy Conor was in. A loudmouth weirdo saying he's gonna annihilate the middleweight division as he's not annihilating the middleweight division. So what does he do? Well, like Conor, he doesn't pick a vulnerable target like Chris Curtis or Marvin Vettori. He just goes straight to the uncut dope. A former 1FC light heavyweight champion whose only losses came from high-profile title fights. And though De Ridder was relatively fresh in the UFC when he fought Bo, the way he finished Gerald Meerschaert and Kevin Holland let the fans know he is not f***ing around. This was and still is debatably the most dangerous fight Bo could have taken without cutting straight to Robert. And since the UFC kingdom works the same way it did back in 2015, you can guarantee that if Bo Nickal slammed that primate to the ground and beat him unconscious, his home Iowa crowd would have gone completely insane, and Bo becomes a top 5 pay-per-view draw instantaneously. You could even look at his middleweight colleague, Khamzat Chimaev. Same situation, same unproven guy who's got a lot to say. His paycheck when he fought Gilbert Burns was $300,000 total if he wins. $150K to show, $150K for the victory. Then he beats Gilbert and now he's making $1 million base with no win bonus. And all it took was one opponent that makes the fans say, oh shit. What if he wins this one? What if everything this guy said is true and now we have a genetic mutation on our hands? That is what translated into a top 5 pay-per-view draw who doesn't even have a title. And that is also the nightmare Bo's gonna have to live with while he sifts through the lost and found for someone who cares. Okay, now that we've established the recipe for success, it's time to bring it all back to Paddy, because he is what I would call an unproven loudmouth in progress. He's unstoppable, check. Talks like he already has the belt, check. Has beat an impressive top 15 contender with a similar career trajectory. Giant, fat, unchecked box, and that is Paddy's dilemma. He's done the same thing we talked about with Bo and Conor, except he disregarded the most important part. The validation. If we go back to Conor specifically, his victory over Dustin Poirier set him up with an easy title eliminator against the Michael Chandler of 2015, Dennis Siver, a 36-year-old muscled-up veteran with an eerily similar record to Michael Chandler. And at that time, he was holding on to his number 10 ranking by a thread. But because Conor had already proven himself beyond a reasonable doubt, that number 10 was plenty justification for Dana to guarantee Conor a shot at Jose should he win. And that's what could have happened if Paddy took his chances with Joel Alvarez or Grant Dawson as opposed to Tony Ferguson. It would have legitimized his spot in the title picture before taking the easy Chandler dub, maximizing his chances at a title fight from the Chandler dub, and maximizing his value as a pay-per-view draw altogether. Instead, he went the opposite direction and took all the easy fights first, which, fantastic if he really is nasty like that. I mean, as a hypothetical future champion, taking these gimmies will have been absolutely essential to his long-term chin health. But if he's not, which Paddy's probably not, everything he is and everything he was dies with Arman Tsarukyan. Or perhaps he sneaks by Arman with a what's left of Gaethje versus Pimblett title eliminator. Gaethje's gonna be 37 years old by the time Paddy fights again, so that's certainly not out of his wheelhouse. But then what? At a certain point, Paddy's gonna have to fight someone who wasn't graciously handpicked, and when his face gets pulpified by that person, the hype train collapses and Paddy joins Bo on the dipshit express. So my question when pondering Paddy's dilemma on the toilet was, why has Dana chosen to slow roll a pseudo-British celebrity for what has now been 7 fights in a row? It was obvious to me that Paddy was top 15 material since his Cage Warriors run, so why the hell hasn't Dana given one of his most popular guys a chance to prove himself after more than 3 years in the organization? That's a way harder question than it sounds, but the MMA gods graced me with the answer around the 14th time I watched McGregor Poirier. I was like, wait a second, those odds look mysteriously similar to the odds from like 2 weeks ago when Bo fought Ranier. And then I went, and thought back to the way Dana promoted Paddy's fight with a weathered Tony Ferguson.
Perfect. If you look at Tony's last few fights that he's fought, he looked damn good before, the Chandler finish.
This version of Biden, intellectually, analytically, is the best Biden ever.
That fight was marketed as Paddy's first real test, despite being a sad joke and a waste of everyone's time. But even if we did accept this as his first real test, one look at the odds paints quite an embarrassing picture. Paddy came in a 3-1 favorite, just like with Bo and Connor, except Bo and Connor were actually fighting savages while Tony Ferguson was experiencing late-stage dementia. So that's not a good look, but then you fast forward to Michael Chandler, who has no business being in the top 15, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and call him Paddy's first actual real test. Paddy comes in at minus 160, despite this being easily the juiciest matchup he could ask for besides Hooker. And if we compare that to the Michael Chandler of old, Dennis Seaver, Connor came in not at minus 160, but a whopping minus 1150. Do you see where I'm headed with this? I said it in the beginning, but I'll reiterate it with all the fun history we've learned. The UFC does not believe in Paddy Pimblett. Dana knew since the beginning that Paddy likely doesn't have the skills to seriously challenge for a world title, just like he knew, as well as the odds makers knew, that Conor McGregor actually did have the skills to pit his hype train against another surging title contender. Bo Nickel did have the skills, in theory, to smash Reinier de Ridder and become the American Khamzat. That's why Dana didn't waste time slow rolling the two of them. I mean, first of all, what the f***? Dana has no interest in slow rolling anyone if he thinks they can snag the belt and make him a shit ton of money. So the only reason Dana would be slow rolling Paddy is because he knows Cash Mountain's gonna implode the second Paddy gets whooped by a worthy opponent. Paddy's talked himself up so much that a TKO loss to Arman followed by a 25-minute Grant Dawson smother and that's all she wrote. But at the same time, there have been so many favorable matchups for Paddy at the razor's edge of the top 15 that squeezing out all the money Dana can before the inevitable has mostly been a breeze. Paddy didn't have to fight Benoit, Grant, Joel, Ignacio, Nasrat, Chase, a whole lot of extremely threatening young guys. Now he finds himself ranked number 8 in the world with an entire nation behind him, and there is officially nowhere to run. Justin Gaethje is his easiest out, but is highly unlikely to risk his spot for Paddy at this point in his career. Charles Oliveira still looks golden, though he doesn't have much time left, and I wouldn't be surprised if a loss to Ilia Topuria at UFC 317 causes him to retire. Max is scraping 34 and also still looks golden, but I don't know if he wants the title shot or just to stick with the BMF thing, so I wouldn't even put him in the picture right now. Dustin Poirier is obviously gonzo after UFC 318. Dan Hooker's riding 3 big wins in a row, so if he's fighting, it's going to be for a title eliminator. And just like Charles and Justin, I don't see Hooker making another run after this, leaving one lone survivor at the bottom of the pile. Arman, who's supposed to be next in line for the title, but he lost that spot with the quickness when he pulled out at 311. This was a decision he wasn't very happy with and was even more unhappy when they offered him Mateusz Gamrot, hence the reason Mateusz is fighting Ledovit and not Arman. But very soon, Dana's gonna let Arman know there is no number 1 contender's privilege. Aside from that, there are literally 3 options left for him to get back in the mix now that he's turned down Gamrot. Those options are Justin Gaethje, Dan Hooker, and Paddy the Baddy. Now logically you'd think, alright, Gaethje versus Sarukian for the true number 1 contendership, and then Hooker versus Pimblett for the next spot in line. But unfortunately, Justin Gaethje just fought his 1 fight per year, so we're not going to see him till late 2026 if we're lucky. And Dan Hooker's hand surgery went down roughly a week before this video was posted, leaving one lone survivor at the bottom of Arman's pile, Paddy. He's the only guy in the top 8 who's not booked, injured, or inactive, and if Dana wants to keep the hype train rolling, Arman is the guy. There is no more running away. There's no more sending Paddy through the UFC on a butterscotch river. No senior citizens, no borderline senior citizens, none of that. We've reached the end of the road, and it's time to find out if the prospect Dana never believed in has what it takes to do the impossible.